All right, so you've drafted your body paragraphs. You've drafted the part of the introduction where you present and define the two terms of your tension. What do you do next? Well, now is the time to craft the thesis. And what the thesis does is creates an umbrella for all four of the paragraph level claims that you've made in your paper. That's really the way to think about it. The thesis is the frame into which all of your body paragraph claims about each of the artifacts you study should fit. So with that in mind, let's look at the rubric criteria. It says that the thesis answers a guiding question. Now that's what we've been doing with our claim sentences, right? Answering a guiding question. The difference is that the thesis asks that guiding question for all of the works discussed in the essay collectively, while a claim asks and answers the guiding question only for the artifact in that body paragraph. So when you draft your thesis, you're going to sort of need maybe a different model than you follow with the claim. It's going to be closely related, but it's going to be different. And I like to talk about those models as a range or a list structure, something that tells us where the artifacts you've discussed fall on this spectrum that you've identified, this spectrum of ideas that create the cultural tension. Remember, just like the claims, you're going to use both terms in your cultural tension so your reader has a clear structure to follow your argument. Let's look at a couple samples because this is actually something easier to see and to explain when you're actually looking at them. And I included two sample thesis statements on the rubric. One is what I call the range thesis, where you don't list all four of your artifacts, but you list at least a couple of them to create a range. Use that word ranging. And you again answer the guiding question. So here we see that the range is from Twain's Roughing It to The Searchers. And then you hear the answer to the question, which is how racial hierarchy prevailed over rising ideals of racial equality. Hierarchy trumps racial equality. In other words, what this thesis is saying is the various texts that I look at in this paper are going to show how ultimately racial hierarchy prevails over rising equality. That doesn't prohibit me from talking about an artifact that emphasizes racial equality. But what the thesis is saying is that overall, more of these artifacts emphasize the enduring power of racial hierarchy than racial equality. So that's a really good example of a range thesis. A list thesis basically identifies all the text you're going to look at. So in our case, it would be 4. I think there's 3 here. And again, answers the guiding question using an active verb and both terms from the tension. So narratives by Little Bear, Mrs. Spotted Hornbill, and Black Elk denounce the horrors of racial hierarchy and assert racial equality. So this paper is focused on Native American narratives that are going to say, expose racial hierarchy as a sort of moral atrocity and counter-argue for racial equality by asserting the dignity of Native Americans. Now again, I could insert another artifact in this paper that doesn't do that. I can go in different directions in the paper as long as the overall pattern is what I discuss in my tension. But in that case, if I was going to do I'd probably be better off doing a range thesis than a list thesis. If you're going to do a list thesis, you got to make sure the language in the thesis lines up with what you list. All right, so there's a pretty good selection of sample thesis statements along with the rubric criteria. Let's take 1 second and look at Megan's thesis just as one more example for us. So here I've called up Megan's thesis on the computer screen, and can't really get it to highlight there for you. And so much for highlighting. But it starts here with paintings. And you can see that this is a list thesis. If you remember, her paper looks at 3 paintings and 1 passage from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And so she lists those in her thesis. And then she says, collectively suggests that while a desire for racial equality was stirring in America, racial hierarchy remained the dominant reality of American life. So again, we get a range here, right? So this is a kind of a clever thesis because it allows her to talk about equality and images of equality and language arguing for equality in her artifacts, but also allows her to recognize the overarching pattern, which is that racial hierarchy prevails. And that the way the racial hierarchy prevails doesn't mean that it has to prevail in all 4 documents, right? In all 4 artifacts. As long as it prevails in a majority of them, this thesis accurately represents the scope of the paper. So Megan, I think, gives us a real nice example of a list thesis that is a model that could work very well in your papers. I hope this overview of thesis statements, the rubric criteria, the samples on the rubric, and an example from Megan's sample essay that we've been sharing, I hope they all help clarify this for you. I want to point out that thesis statements are a great opportunity for you to text or email me with a quick question. You draft your thesis, you're not sure it's good, send me a quick text. Hey, Jim, how does this sound? Send me a quick email. How does this thesis sound? It's real easy for me to send you quick feedback. So don't forget that while the video lecture introduces you to the material, I'm always available to help you refine your own efforts to master it. Okay, thanks for your attention. See you in Blackboard.